To continue the main debate, I look to West Streeting Labour Member of Parliament for Ilford North to conclude the case for proposition.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's a great privilege to be here at what is a historic debate in the tradition of this fine institution. And far be it for people to say that Labour Party are pessimists about our country and don't celebrate its successes. I think it's a remarkable thing that this university can boast quite rightly to be one of the best in the world and yet be only the second best in our country. What an amazing achievement that is. Unless that provocative introduction should persuade you to vote against the proposition just out of spite, just remember that my esteemed colleague, the Shadow Home Secretary, is a proud member of this institution. And if you are minded to vote against me, just think of the Shadow Home Secretary when you walk through those doors. But joking aside, because I think we get quite enough jokes from the Prime Minister. In his speech to the Conservative Party conference, the Prime Minister described, by his own words, his own admission, a country that has low growth, low skills, and low productivity. He described a country where there are gaps in investment and opportunity right across the land. He described a country where there is lower life expectancy, not just between different regions, but within different regions of our country. Well, who's been in government for the last 11 years, and how could anyone have confidence in a Conservative government that delivers those kinds of outcomes for our country? He delivered that speech against the backdrop of empty shelves, empty petrol pumps, and increasingly empty wallets. Well, who could have confidence in a government that can't even get the basics right? He talked about the great achievements of the pandemic. But let's not forget that going into the pandemic, our country was needlessly, dangerously, and avoidably exposed to the pandemic as a result of the decimation of our public services over more than a decade. Care homes where older people were more and more dangerously exposed to the pandemic than they would have been if only the government had just honoured one of its commitments to solve the social care crisis. And of course, we went into the pandemic with higher levels of inequality in our country, which left people dangerously exposed to the pandemic than when the Conservatives came to power in 2010. And if that's not convincing enough, how could anyone have confidence in a government and in a Prime Minister that as people were dying, as our country was locked down, said to his cabal of advisors, when urged to act more quickly, more decisively, more affirmatively to avoid needless loss of life, said, and I quote, "Let the bodies pile high." If you have confidence in a government and in a Prime Minister that says something like that in the middle of a deadly pandemic, I don't know what you could possibly be thinking. And of course, this is a Prime Minister that clung on to an advisor who stretched the limitations of public support for the lockdown restrictions, showing, as usual with the Conservatives, it's one rule for them and one rule for everyone else. If only Boris Johnson had shown the same level of loyalty to Dominic Cummings that Dominic Cummings showed the Prime Minister, he may not have done so much damage to the public confidence in the restrictions as he did. But this is a government of empty slogans. The government that said it would get Brexit done. The government that boasted it got Brexit done. And now we see the same government, in fact, not even the same government, the same minister trying to open up a deal that he himself negotiated. The same minister who told us this was a great historic deal. It was good for the country. Now appearing on our television screens only this morning to tell us that this deal is no good for our country. How could anyone have confidence in a government like that? A government that says it's for global Britain, the same government that abolished the Department for International Development, that reneged on the 0.7% commitment to aid spending, and the government where, in the midst of the worst foreign policy disaster since Suez, saw the Foreign Secretary lounging around on a beach while British troops were working hard to mount the evacuation. How could anyone have confidence in a government like that? A government that claims to be levelling up. A government that claims to be levelling up in the same week as the Prime Minister told the Conservative Party conference he's all about levelling up. This was the same government that was taking £20 a week out of the pockets of the poorest people in our country. That's not levelling up. It's punching down on the poorest mums and dads and their kids. 200,000 more children in poverty. And speaking of empty promises, let's turn to the empty vessel that is the Prime Minister himself. Sir Geoffrey Cox described him, said that one of the characteristics of leadership is authenticity. Well, I think if Sir Geoffrey Cox is describing Boris Johnson as an authentic politician, he obviously turned up too soon for the wine and gin tasting and overindulged, because Boris Johnson is anything other than authentic. This is someone who joined the SDP at this institution to win the votes of your predecessors to become president of this union. This is the Prime Minister who wrote two versions of the same article because he hadn't decided whether he was for or against Brexit before he came down on one side. Someone described him as a Prime Minister that's hard to pin down. So don't take my word for him. Ask one of his many wives. And as for the and look, some people will say that's punching below the belt. But you know what? I don't think it is, actually. It's not punching below the belt when we have a Prime Minister describe black people as pickaninnies with watermelon smiles. It's not punching below the belt when we've got a Prime Minister describe gay people as tank-top bum boys. And it's not punching below the belt when we have a Prime Minister that, when hate crime in this country is rising and Muslim women are bearing the brunt of it, describe Muslim women who wear the veil as pillar boxes and bank robbers. You know, that's punching below the belt, and that's below the dignity of the office of Prime Minister. Why should no There are some people tonight who are Conservative Party supporters, voters, who will be uncomfortable voting against the government, who in their heart of hearts know this isn't a government you could have confidence in. I mean, we've got Robert Buckland as a case in point on the benches opposite. But, you know, to you, I just say this. The reason you should vote to have no confidence in this government is because you should try and get your party back. Because this isn't a Conservative party, this isn't a Conservative government. It's a fundamentally unconservative government. There are things I admire about the Conservative Party and associate with the best traditions of the Conservative Party. Defence of the rule of law, a focus on law and order, defending our armed forces, upholding the monarchy, and look at their record. This is a government that attacks the judiciary and had judges painted as the enemy. This is a government that hasn't put more police on the streets but has defunded the police and taken them off our streets. This is the government that has left us with some of the most poorly resourced armed forces in memory. This is a government that dragged the monarchy into the centre of constitutional crisis by proroguing Parliament quite illegally because they didn't want parliamentary scrutiny and accountability. This is a government, a Conservative government, with the highest level of taxes since 1945 and the highest level of public spending. But you know what I take issue with is that they're unfair taxes and they're spending unwisely. Just look at the crony contracts and the billions given to their mates. If only we could all be Matt Hancock's landlord. Now, there's been a lot of talk about, in order to have no confidence in the government, you have to have confidence in the opposition. There is no such burden, but it doesn't trouble me because you should have confidence anyway. Up against a Prime Minister that I described, I'd put Keir Starmer any day. Someone with integrity, conviction, and a lifetime of public services, upholding the law and standing up for justice. There are a whole number of things the Labour Party's argued for in the last 6 years, in fact, the last 11 years since we left office, that I describe as essential, central Labour values, Labour policies, and you'll see lots of them in the next Labour manifesto, I'm sure, too. But the big divide in the Labour Party, which has been referred to this evening, isn't between left and right. It's between those who've understood why we've lost 4 elections in a row and those who've chosen not to. And the people leading the Labour Party have understood that lesson. And let me just share a central message with you, a central lesson for the Labour Party. Whenever we're in opposition, people assume the Labour Party's heart's in the right place, but we always have to reassure them that our head's in the right place too. So yes, we'll invest in public services, but we're the party of law and order, we're the party of national security, we're the party that can be trusted with your money. And on each and every one of those tests, we're working hard to earn back trust. And you've seen that, and you will see that from the things that our party is saying. But before people get too gloomy about the state of our politics and just say we're all the same and things can never be different, and I appreciate that to this audience, this is now more of a history lecture than contemporary politics, because it's been so long since we won a general election. But if you want to know what levelling up looks like, I'll tell you. It is 2 million children lifted out of poverty. It's the highest level of investment in education in history. It's the highest level of funding per pupil. It's the gap between state schools and private schools narrowing funding. It's better outcomes in education. It's the record levels of investment and better outcomes in the National Health Service. You want to look at levelling up? The last Labour government was about levelling up, and that's what the next Labour government will do too. So, whether you're voting with your heads or your heart this evening, the choice is very simple and straightforward. Looking at their record, looking at the outcomes and looking at the consequences, how could you possibly have confidence in Her Majesty's government?